Good morning, everybody. Thank you all so much for being here. We're really excited about this session this morning. Good morning, Mr. House. Good morning, Silas House
Morning.
there joining us. Glad that you are here. We're so excited to have you with us today and to talk about Clay's Quilt and about Appalachian literature and the integration of that into our programs and all of that kind of fun stuff. You guys, for the last 4 weeks now, we have been talking about Clay's Quilt and reading it together and having hour-long discussions once a week about it and really kind of doing a deep dive into it and trying to figure out everything that you're trying to say in this and what we're taking from it and how we can use that in our programs across Kentucky. And so I just wanted to share just a little bit. We work with in education in classrooms across Kentucky with kids who are in the care or custody of the Commonwealth. So we have classrooms located in group homes and hospitals and drug and treatment alcohol treatment centers. We have teachers in classrooms located within juvenile justice facilities across the state. So we have about 13,000 kids that we serve each year in all kinds of different programs all across Kentucky, from Pikeville all the way to Paducah and everywhere in between. So that's kind of who we serve. You all know, those of us who have been studying this, you know Silas's history, you know about his work. He, as you all know, is a renowned author. He has 6 novels. Clay's Quilt was his first novel, which is the one that we've looked at that came out in 2001. We have a trilogy of The Parchment of Leaves and then The Coal Tattoo. Eli the Good came out, then Same Sun Here, which was a co-authored book. And then his latest, which is Southernmost, which is another great, fantastic book that I hope that you guys will also check out after this. So you'll see that as well. But today we're going to primarily focus on Clay's Quilt and talk a little bit about that. In addition to writing all of these, he also wrote 3 different plays so far. One of those, by the way, I should just add, was This Is My Heart for You, which was produced and premiered at Berea College, which is my alma mater. And so my claim to fame is that Silas and I attended that play together in 2012. He doesn't know that, but he was there and I was on the complete opposite side of the auditorium and never spoke. But still, my claim to fame is that we attended that play, his premiere there in Berea way back a long time ago now. But it was fantastic and just another great example of the work that he has done. So with all of that being said, Silas, we are glad that you're here. Thank you for joining us. We're excited for the conversation this morning. So we'll just jump in and ask a couple of questions if that's okay, or how do you normally do this?
Well, whatever you want to do is, can you hear me?
Yeah,
Okay.
We can hear you.
Whichever way you want to do is fine. I can tell you a little bit about why I wrote the book and how, or we can just go right into questions.
Let's start with that. That's on my list, so let's do that first.
Well, I was a student at Eastern, getting my BA, and I was a commuter. I didn't get to stay at the school. I drove back and forth to Corbin. So I did most of my education at Corbin and Manchester, but in my last year I had to drive to Richmond. And so I carpooled with a couple of other people from my county. And I had always been a writer. I'd always loved writing. But when you're from Kentucky or a rural place or working class or whatever, the whole culture sort of teaches you that that's not a value. And so I was writing a lot of stuff that I really didn't have any experience of. I didn't understand, I would set stuff in Hawaii and it would be about rich people in Hawaii or, something like that, because I thought that's what could get published. Well, so on those trips, on those commutes, we would have to stay on campus all day, between classes. And sometimes I would read what I was writing to my friends. And one of them that I rode with, she said, why don't you write something that you actually know about? Why don't you write about us and like who we are? How people our age are. She said, I'd like to read a book about people our age in Kentucky, because you never see that. You only see the Great Depression, or um, everything seems to be set in the far past for the most part in literature and media, period, about rural people and working class people. And so I thought, well, I'll give that a try. And immediately, as soon as I gave it a try, I had a story that I knew was really worth telling. I also knew from having a couple of, from reading a lot and having a couple of good writing teachers at Eastern, that one way to make a good story is to write what you know. And so I really drew on what my life was like at the time. And at the time, all I was doing was working 40 hours a week. I worked at a steakhouse in Corbin, going to school. I don't know how many hours a week. I guess I had a 12-hour class load or maybe more. And then on the weekends, all we did was party. And we went out to these wild honky tonks and we, witnessed or got into fist fights. And, so I ran with a whole bunch of people that did that. And I know I wasn't the only one, but I certainly had this sense of, I don't want to do this my whole life. I want something else. And so that was sort of the thesis for Clay, was that he wants his own story, you know? And one of his big struggles is that he's been defined by his mother's story, by the fact that his mother was murdered under mysterious circumstances. And before that, she had this big, over the top life. She was such a force. And so I think that lots of times that happens, especially in small towns, in rural places. I know that a lot of the way I was defined growing up was because all of my uncles were great athletes and were known athletes. And I went to this school that was known for basketball. And I wasn't a very good athlete. I mean, I loved basketball, but I wasn't great at it. But I was defined by them. I was also defined by the fact that my grandfather had murdered somebody. And that had happened 50 years before in an act of self defense. But still, his grandchildren, if you were a house in Laurel County, you were sort of known as one of those crazy houses, because your past defined who you were. And it all went back to my grandfather, who killed this man because this man drunkenly shot into their house and almost killed my grandmother. Anyway, you can see how I'm drawing on all those things. The other thing I really drew on is that when I was 11 years old, my uncle was murdered. Um, and I just really saw the way that had these ramifications uh, throughout not only our family, but the whole community. And it changed everything. Uh, this act of violence did much more than just kill my uncle. In lots of ways, it destroyed my family. Um, it destroyed the culture of our family. It destroyed the storytelling tradition in our family because it changed it. It was too painful to talk about things that my Uncle Jack was involved in. So he sort of became a legend more than a person, and sort of a saint instead of a person. And so anyway, I wanted to explore some of those things. I wanted to explore the way storytelling shapes a place and a family. I wanted to especially look at the way violence has ramifications far beyond the act of violence. Um, one thing about rural, working class, and especially Appalachian people in media, when I say media, I mean film, TV, commercials, comic books, and literature, um, is that we're always portrayed as violent and also as remorselessly violent. And so I wanted to have a book that really indicted violence and showed characters who felt a deep sense of remorse for that violence. So, of course, that's what happens in the third act with Clay. Um, but the main thing I wanted to do was, I couldn't find a book that was about my generation or anywhere close. The closest I could find was set in the late 1960s, and it was by Gurney Norman, a great book called Kinfolks, a short story collection that some of you may know. But that was 25 or 30 years removed. And so I wanted something that was just as contemporary as it could be. And right up to the moment this book was published, I was putting in pop culture references and things like that. Like I remember the last thing I added was a reference to Bill Clinton because I really wanted it to. I wanted it to be as current as it could be. Um, and so, I'm doing things throughout the book like that, just little bitty things to show you you're in the modern world. Now, what I find so interesting is that despite my desire to really put this in a modern context, and I go out of my way to tell you that Clay makes pretty good money as a coal miner, as coal miners would have at this time. He manages to build this great little house, and you're told that he puts vinyl siding on it, and it's a nice little house that he has built. And yet, when I go to visit other parts of the country that have read Clay's Quilt, if I go to a high school, for instance, lots of times they'll have students make dioramas or posters, or they'll make book trailers, and things like that, which I love. But so often the students will they'll draw the characters in like bib overalls and barefoot and wearing straw hats. Well, none of the characters in Clay's Quilt would wear that. And they will also, in the dioramas, they have like little shacks or log cabins and things like that. And so these things are so deeply ingrained in the national consciousness that even though the novel goes out of its way to be realistic about the region, and I tried to show it, I wanted to show it as a place that was very, had different ways of life, and had different ways of living. Some people live in, Gabe lives in a double wide, right? And then Easter lives in a little house with vinyl siding, and Clay builds this new house, and etc. Yet it's been ingrained in us for over 100 years that people in this part of the country and people who are working class live a certain way. We all know that people live in lots of different ways. So that's just something I think is interesting in going around the country talking about the book. The other thing that is really interesting to me is hearing from international readers who say that the book really resonates with them. Um, and I think that's because when you're from a very specific culture, lots of these themes are the same. For instance, I don't know, maybe if you're from a Hispanic community, these themes of really close knit family would be very familiar. Um, the presence of music all the time, things like that. If you're from a specific community like an African American community, often the church plays such a big role in your life. Whether you go to church or not, it defines the culture, and things like that. So the book really does transcend Eastern Kentucky and Appalachia, because it is about these really um, sort of universal things in the way families operate, you know, and also just the desire to. I think one reason it's taught a lot as a first year experience in college is because it's a lot about breaking away, trying to break away, but also not wanting to break away. Like he loves his family so much, but he also knows that he needs his own story. And he moves like 7 miles away, and they are just, Easter's just devastated, and Gabe is that's actually based on my own life because in my family, you pull a trailer in your family's front yard and you live there until maybe you buy a lot next door and pull your trailer over there, or you build a house there. But you pretty much stay, as close as you can. And when somebody doesn't stay close, it is a major source of grief. I live in Lexington now, and my parents live near Corbin. It takes me about an hour and 15 minutes to get to their house, but they act like I live in England or something. It's just it just about kills them to have to drive to Lexington to to come up here. It's just too far. But anyway, I think all that stuff is very. I think the reason Clay's Quilt has managed to, it's never been out of print. It's continued to sell. It's continued to be used in colleges and high schools and things like that, and book clubs. And I think it's because of those essential truths that are in it. And also, the final thing I'll say before I turn it over to y'all is I had no idea what I was doing when I wrote this book. I mean, I had had a couple of literature classes where I had great teachers who talked about the writing process, but I had never had an actual writing class. Um, I sort of learned how to be a writer by reading and by talking to other readers mostly. And so I think Clay's Quilt really benefits from that because it's so story driven. It's very readable in that way, in that as the writer, I'm not getting really caught up a lot in literary devices and things like that, because I'm just telling the story of these people. I also really presented it, I wanted it to be as cinematic as possible. So if you go through the book, you'll notice that it's really set up like a film. Films are set up in like 3 or 4 minute scenes, and each scene has a beginning, middle, and end. And then you go to the next scene, it has a beginning, middle, and end. It's 3 or 4 minutes long, whatever. Clay's Quilt's the same way, and the point of view changes the way it does in a film as well. So hopefully, it feels cinematic to you because I really intended for it to be that sort of movie going experience. Um, and one reason I did that is because I wanted it to be language driven and character driven, but I also wanted it to be active, and I wanted it to almost be like a thriller, and the book's sort of constructed so that you're getting, I mean, there is a literal quilt in the book, but you're also getting pieces of the story and sort of collecting it. And as the reader, you're quilting it together to figure out exactly what did happen to Anna and why, and et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah.
So I could talk for a whole hour just about the process, but I'll turn it
I'm just
over
going
to
to lay
y'all.
you. Everybody here would much rather hear you talk than me talk.
I want to hear what y'all have to say, though.
Well, one, I'm just going to, before I get into, did you work at David's Steakhouse?
Yes, it was Western Steer back then.
Oh, Western.
Yep.
Well, I worked at
Yep.
Shoney's across the street. I
Wow.
grew up in
Yep.
Corbin too.
Uh,
My family still lives there, and I live in Frankfurt now. And I'm telling you, my mom's never driven to Frankfurt. It's too far. So
yep.
it's just, that's out of the question.
Yep.
But you bring up a lot of things that we talked about over the last 4 weeks, really getting into this. And one of the things that I really like about the book, and one of the things that you've talked about in other places, is really this juxtaposition between um, good and evil, this complexity of the character that you
Mhm.
can have within you, both these really striking positive things, but also this real struggle that's going on. And we talked a lot about that as it relates to our students too, because our
Mhm.
students some of them have been involved with the justice system, and others have been involved with other systems their whole life, and that complexity of the character. Can you talk a little bit about why you thought it was so critical to really illustrate the complexity of
Mhm.
those characters and what we get from that in the story?
Well, I think the main thing is that at that time, what I was thinking was I was just writing about the people I knew, and I was showing them in all of their complexity, their faults, what was good about them, their joys and their sorrows. And that was real important to me because I constantly saw my people. And when I say that, I especially mean rural people presented in very simplistic ways, either as very, very good or very, very bad, and no in between. It's like they're either saints or they're sinners, they're villains or they're saintly. I mean, if you look at Beverly Hillbillies, right? It's very clear they're good guys and bad guys or whatever. I mean, any kind of rural representations like that. Um, People look back on the Waltons as a really romantic, sentimental TV show. Some of you are too young to know the Waltons, um, but it was a really complex portrayal of rural working class people, and it was really foundational for me. And that's one of the main things I was drawing on as a first time novelist, was thinking about how complicated those characters were. But it was mostly just that each of the characters in here are composites of people I know. None of the characters are based on one person that I knew, but they're usually based on two people and then a fictional element. So I take those three things and sort of braid them together and build a character. So I mean, every character in the book, I can point to the main person I'm thinking of, but then I also fictionalize them, mainly because I wanted to have the freedom of them doing what I wanted them to do, but also, of course, uh, I don't want anybody to recognize themselves, so I have to fictionalize it too. Um, and when you do that, it just makes them more three dimensional. You know, when you take those three strains and braid them together. Um, yeah,
One of the things that you talked about in your opening was um, how this is cross cultural. This book, I mean, we've talked a lot about that in this study together. When we look at our student populations and using this book with our student populations, it is very rural focused.
mhm,
But a lot of the themes that are throughout can be carried cross culturally. And so we have in our system a large number of kids who are from Jefferson County, who are from Louisville, from kind of what we would have our biggest city in the state. And so we've talked a lot about how this can be used with those students too, because we want to use this book with all of our kids. And so I think that's really important, the ability to kind of cross culturally look at this and how it's applicable to a
mhm.
lot of different things. But in
Yeah,
regard to our students that are here and the students that we work with, um, they've been um, all of them, almost all of them. Some still live at home, but most of them have been removed from their homes. They've been placed into a juvenile facility or into a group home setting, and there's some displacement, obviously, from their families through that process. And one of the things I think that's obviously one of the strongest themes in your book is, and in all of your writings, is the importance of family and kind of that connection to family and a connection to home and a connection to place. How do you think, as kind of an author, the author of this book, how do you think we can kind of use this in the context of working with our students who are oftentimes displaced from
mhm.
that home?
Well, I mean, I think displacement's a major theme in this book. People often laugh about the fact that they go on this big journey and it's to Myrtle Beach. It's like, but when I was growing up, I mean, I didn't see the ocean until I was 18 years old because my family we either went to Gatlinburg or we went to the lake. That was vacation. For one thing, we couldn't afford it. For another thing, my parents just didn't want to go that far away. Um, and so in Clay's Quilt, Myrtle Beach is almost like this promised land. And then they get there and he's just like, well, it's the end of America, and I'm looking out at this ocean, and I just want to be home. Um, but it's also about being displaced just 7 miles away, trying to find your own story and all that. So there's a lot of homesickness in it. The other thing in here, I think, I'm betting that a lot of your students can really relate to being stereotyped, and that's a big theme in the book too. I mean, when they get to Myrtle Beach, there's this scene. One of my favorite scenes is Alma is playing the fiddle, and all these people sort of gather around on the balcony and watch her, and she gets offended by something one of the men says. I can't remember exactly, but it's kind of
You
condescending.
people play really well, or
Yeah,
something.
you people. Yeah, and that idea of being having assumptions about you because of what people think they know. I'm sure a lot of your students can relate to that aspect. And also, I mean, maybe I'm stereotyping, but based on what you said, some of these students are probably familiar with violence um, in their lives to some degree. And of course, that's a major theme in the book is being, you know, not having any choice, but being encased in that violence. Um, And I think displacement means lots of things. Of course, it's not just physical, right? It's also the spiritual idea, the metaphorical idea of displacement is in the book. And one big one big paradox in rural communities, of course, and maybe even all origin communities is that, well, I'll just say it this way: when you're from a rural place, there's this question about, do I go off and become successful, or do I try to stay here and serve my community? And if I do not stay here, am I betraying my community? and all this. And so it's sort of responsibility that's put on you when you're from a specific culture. And I do think that transcends not just working class, but I know I have African American students I teach at Berea College who talk to me all the time about the way their families expect them to come back to Louisville or wherever, to Birmingham or wherever, and serve that community, serve that black community there instead of going off to Washington D.C. or something. So those questions are um, always a part of, especially if you're from a specific culture. But I think everybody goes through that to some degree,
Yeah.
deciding what place do you have the responsibility. Should you can you better serve your people from afar or from within?
Yeah. And that's one of the things I think you've talked about before. You kind of your family roots are in Leslie County, right? And so they moved to London kind of for work. And now I think in one of the interviews I watched with you, as you talked about that you don't have I don't think you have any family left in Leslie. Everybody's kind of moved out. How
Mhm.
does that impact you personally and your sense of place to the region?
Uh, well, I mean, the main thing it, excuse me, the main thing it makes me really sad, you know, um, to try, you want to go back and see the old home place, but the old home place has been taken over by, you know, somebody else. And so there's a loss there. And I think a lot of it comes from, being from a family that didn't have the money to keep that home place, et cetera. Um, it just reminds me of how important class is in our world, that it just shapes everything. But at the same time, I think, especially when you're from, I don't mean to be too Eastern Kentucky centric, but I'm assuming some of you will be teaching in there. Um, but also to some degree, when you're from Eastern Kentucky, the place that I grew up in, for instance, is gone. Even though it's still there, even though my parents still live on the same road where I grew up, it's gone really, because it's been really changed by the opioid epidemic. It's been really changed by mobility. When I was growing up in Lilly, Kentucky, I knew everybody. I mean, I could go to anybody's yard or anybody's house. I knew them. If I wasn't kin to them, my family had known them for generations. And that's just not the way it is now. Um, and so that's troubling too when you're from a gone place. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And so one thing that Clay's Quilt is about to me is a community that's holding on and, remaining tight knit in that way as much as it can. But there's also a lot of commentary about Easter says something like a seed that goes too far can't find its roots or something like that. And this idea that, you shouldn't stray too far. Um, and that's not something I really live by. I tell my students, you should do what is best for you, and you don't you don't owe anybody anything, etc. Um, but it is something to always talk about.
I wonder what it would be like today, now, 30 years later, from the time period that it was kind of set in. Would it still be holding on to that
Hmm.
place, or would it be like so many of our home communities now?
Hmm. Well, I have a whole sequel to Clay's Quilt in my head, um, and it deals a lot with the way the community has changed. It deals some with the way pharmaceutical companies laid waste to those communities. Um, and it also just is a lot about the way politics has really changed the place and taken over. And I grew up in a place where lots of different kinds of people got together and talked about things. And now that divide is so stark that doesn't happen anymore. I mean, the past 4 years have divided churches and um, families and everything where I'm from. I mean, I have lots of family members who won't speak to each other because of the last election and things like that. And that just didn't happen when I was growing up. I mean, people had different political ideas, but it wasn't as charged, and so all these things um, I would like to explore in the sequel.
Yeah.
Um, the
We'd
sequels.
love to read it.
Well, if I can ever sit down and write it, my problem is I always have too many ideas and not enough time. I have 3 novels in my head right now, and I have to find the time to sit down and write them.
Yeah, I saw an interview that you've kind of described that Clay's Quilt was kind of almost loosely autobiographical, but that the other novels since then have kind of been sent to you almost as a gift
Mhm.
in a lot of ways.
Yeah, my most autobiographical novel is Eli the Good,
Mhm.
and it's set in Corbin. In Eli the Good, I call it Refuge, but that's my most autobiographical book. And Clay's Quilt would be a close second, although it's a lot more fictionalized than Eli the Good. Yeah.
Yeah. So I don't know if when you came on, you heard that we were playing a little bit of music
Hmm.
from the book. So I know on Spotify, all of your books have a playlist on
Hmm.
Spotify that kind of come from the book. And we did that each week when we started for like the
Great.
15 minutes before we played the songs from the book and the importance of that. Can you talk a little bit about the importance of music and why you thought it was so critical to put it in your book? And then also kind of from that, um, how we can use that in our classes
Hmm.
with our students today.
Well, I think that when the book came out, it got a lot of media attention because of the use of music. Somebody went through the book, and there's like 65 musical references or something like that. Um, I didn't do that intentionally. That was just the world that I lived in. Music was just such a part of my life. My mother's a really great gospel singer who's sung all over Eastern Kentucky and Southwest Virginia. Um, my uncle's a great banjo player. Um, my cousin's a country singer who sang in the local honky tonk. You can probably guess who she's based on, and or who Margaret, what's her name? Evangeline is based on her. Um, I mean, and also there's not a day goes by that I don't listen to music, that I don't play music. It's just such a huge part of my life. And so one of the ways I build characters is by getting to know them musically. If I know a character's favorite song, I know a lot about them. Um, and so this book actually led to me having a side career as a music journalist, um, which has been really wonderful. I've worked with Chris Christopherson, uh, Casey Musgraves, Jason Isbell, Leanne Womack, Lucinda Williams,
Tyler Childers.
yes, et cetera, et cetera. And it's because of this book, because the music that's used in this book gave me that side career as a music writer. I think that it works really well to use music because, frankly, it's so much easier to listen to music than it is to read a book. And so, any gateway in that way for a student, I think if you can show them the opening of the book and then play the song, Me and Bobby McGee, and then have a conversation about how is this song relevant to this scene, that just creates some conversation. Before you know it, they're talking about the literature and finding thematic things, metaphors, all that stuff that they wouldn't have realized before without listening to that song in relation to it. So I think it's a great teaching tool. There's not one song in this book that's mentioned that's not thematically relevant. I never just pick a song for the heck of it and put it in. I mean, the opening scene is about these wild, free spirited, carefree people who get in a real mess. And in fact, his mother's killed. Um, Lots of people, when they read the book, and this was surprising to me, thought that she was killed in a car wreck.
We all did. We
Yeah. And I
till
mean,
till we got to that part of the book.
and I love that. I'm glad because it makes it more of a mystery, more suspense driven. And then when you find out she was actually murdered, it's more interesting, right? But anyway, Me and Bobby McGee, I think it's just so cinematic because these women are singing the song in the back seat. Meanwhile, in the front seat, all this tension is happening between Aneth and the driver. And Clay, as a little boy, is just sort of trapped in the middle of it all. He has no control. And that's what the whole song is about, finding your power, finding your control. And it also mentions Kentucky, the Kentucky coal mines. I mean, I don't know about y'all, but in our 20s, when we were out partying and me and Bobby McGee would play, we would all sing the Kentucky coal mines line as loud as we could. You looked for things to be proud of in media as much as you can like that when most media is telling you to be ashamed of where you're from. So, I mean, I was thinking lots of reasons to use a song, that particular song, or whatever song throughout the rest of the book. Um, so I think it's a great teaching tool.
Yeah, I do too. Thank you for that. So we have a little while longer. We have lots of folks on here who have read the book. We've been talking about questions that they've had as they've gone through the book for the last 4 weeks. Anybody want to jump in and ask a question, put it in the chat or jump on in? Either way, we'll open the floor. Don't be shy.
If you could go back and add anything to Clay's quilt, any detail, what would you go back and add?
Thank you for asking that, because I wanted to say my biggest regret about this book is that I really wish I had I don't think it's an authentic portrayal of my generation, simply because there's not enough focus on going to college in it. By the time people my age, more people were concerned in that culture about getting a college education. In this book, the only person who really talks about that is Dreama, and Clay is encouraging her to go to the community college and get a degree. But I think there should have been a little bit more focus on that to be totally authentic. So that's my big regret. I wish I could go back, and I wish that, at least Dreama was in college and was trying to get a degree. Now, I mean, in my world that I was living in at that time, I was the only person in my family going to college. I'm first generation college graduate. And of my friends, nobody that I ran around with was going to college or had any desire to. But I did know people. So you know what I mean? So I wish that there was better representation about that.
Right.
I mean, I don't think that I don't think the writer is responsible to have a checklist of everything that needs to be done, but I think that I have a responsibility to make it as authentic as possible. Does that make sense?
Well, yeah. Well, I think it's a great representation of the time period. I was in 72 and I grew up in Jackson. So when I read the book, I read it back when it first came out. I read the whole trilogy. And so I'm just going back through it now, but as a teacher to present it to my students this time, I really gave it a different eye and looked at all those details. And I think it's a great you describe it perfectly.
Thank you. Thank you, Kathy. I appreciate that.
All right, other questions? Y'all sure talked a lot the last 4 weeks. Feel free, jump in.
One thing that, we all got invested in all the characters, not just Clay and Alma and them, but, when they found out they were expecting, I was kind of waiting to see Easter's response to find out that Clay was going to be a father. Was there thoughts of, expanding some of that, or was it just, that's not the story you're going to tell? That's part of the story, but it was about Clay and his growth and stuff.
Oh yeah, I mean, there's all kinds of stuff like that that I wrote, and you just have to sort of strip away. One thing that I really regret that we lost was there was a lot more scenes of him at work, and I thought that was important for the book, especially as a young coal miner. I wanted to show him at work more often, but especially when you're working on a first novel with a major publisher, they really want it to be they tend to want it to be, about 300 pages. That's the ideal length for a first novel. And so you're trying to get it down to that as much as you can. That's one thing the editor was doing. So we cut, there was this whole subplot about Clay actually finds his father's family and he becomes close with his father's family, gets to know them and things like that. Um, that's probably the major thing that we cut was that subplot. But I mean, I have dreamed of having a unedited, like an expanded version of Clay's Quilt, where I get to go down all those avenues that I wanted to, and have it like an annotated where I go in and explain things. I would love to do that someday. Um, but yeah, there's just so much that you want to include. But just like you're saying, you're exactly right. You sort of have to figure out the central focus, and everything has to report back to that focus, almost like a thesis that everything has to serve, especially for a first novel. Yeah.
I think you did a great job describing Clay in the coal mines. I think one of a description for you, somebody on one of these discussions weeks ago said they never thought coal soot was sexy before. And and you did a description that for them really kind of put that image in their mind.
That's good to know. Good. Yeah, every man in my family, on my maternal side of my family, except for my father, worked in the mines in some way. And I grew up across from a coal mine, a big strip mine. Um, Coal was sort of dying out in my part of Kentucky when I was a child, but it was one of the first places the first place coal happened in Kentucky was in Laurel County, which is where I mostly grew up, went to high school. Um, but so anyway, the coal industry was something I knew really intimately. And also I wanted to make him a coal miner because it was such an archetype, you know. There's sort of and Alma being a fiddler, she's also an archetype, right? When people think of Appalachian people, they think of coal miners and musicians. They think of a woman that goes to church all the time, like Easter. They think of clairvoyants, people who are in touch with the supernatural world. Um, they think of a good old boy. So you have Cake, right, who serves that role. I mean, so I have all these archetypes that I'm really trying to complexify and get beyond. There is a difference between an archetype and a stereotype. But if you're not careful, the archetype can become a stereotype. And so that's something I was real conscious of in writing the book.
Other folks?
Hello.
Hi.
Talked a lot in the beginning about the imagery and the way you used your words to paint a picture. And I'm looking outside right now, and I had the image of you. I don't know why I thought this, but it's just the weird world I live in. Of you like walking through the forest, like taking note of everything you see. So can you kind of tell us how you went through that process of really making the imagery really crisp when you're talking about the hills?
Well, I think the main thing is that was just, I knew that world so intimately. I've always been a person who spent a lot of time outside. But also when I'm writing, I'm seeing it like a film. And so then I want to write down the essential things that pop in your eye when you're watching a film. So if you go outside, like on a day like today, I mean, and you see a red bird in the snow, I mean, that's a real vivid image. And so to capture that, and of course, the big image that everybody takes away from this book are the cardinals, or as we would say, red birds. And so to me, they became a symbol for Aneth. And really, it's a symbol for Appalachia, for wildness, for the untamed, for being a part of the wilderness, etc. That toughness that those birds have, is indicative of who Aneth is and who the people in the book are. and things like that. So anyway, I say that just to illustrate that I think that when you create imagery, it has to go beyond imagery and serve the story as well. You know, it can't just, you don't just mention it because it's pretty. It has to be important to what's going on in the action too. So, you know, that snow scene creates this sense of tension. You know, all the ice and the road is frozen and all that. So you have that imagery, but that is actually playing a part. Or, you know, if you think of the field of wildflowers, that's in the book, hopefully you have an image of that field of wildflowers swaying in the wind and, you know, all these different colors and all that. But it's also a symbol of sort of the mystical nature of having a dead parent, and needing some kind of totem that represents them, you know, um, and things like that. By the way, I have had so many angry letters from I can't think what they're called right now, but like horticulturalists who will write to me and say, this flower and this flower doesn't bloom at the same time, and you have them blooming at the same time in Clay's quilt. I'm like, it's a magic field, you know, it's magical realism. That's not, they're not supposed to. I know that they don't bloom at the same time, you know. So little things like that are interesting. What people get angry about, especially since the internet, people find it very easy to ball you out about stuff like that.
Rhonda in the comments asked if, because of the visual imagery and because you kind of created this as a film and kind of in your head of how it plays, has there been discussion about making this into a movie?
It was sold to the movies twice, and I published 6 books, and 3 of them have sold to the movies, and none of them made it so far. You know, and that happens a lot. A lot of books are optioned if they have any kind of success. I think they're pretty much picked up, um, and it just languished. I mean, one of the uh, screenplays for Clay's Quilt was really, really good, and they got pretty close. The other one, it was really bad. I mean, really bad. They took all the drugs and alcohol and all that out of it, and made it into sort of more of a family film. And I mean, I think it would make a good family film as it is, you know, with those rough themes. But they made it too. They simplified it too much. Anyway, you know, I would love to see that happen, but I have no control over it at all. You know, if somebody buys it and makes it, that's great, and if they don't, um, they don't. But I do love film, and it's a major part of my writing process. When I'm writing a novel, I can't really look at other novels that are too similar thematically, but I do look a lot at films. I feel like if I'm reading a novel that's too thematically similar, some of it might seep into my own writing and unconsciously, you know, but I can look at film and not worry about that as much. So I do think that helps the books be more cinematic too, since I am looking. When I'm writing a book, I use a lot of visual stuff. I, you know, I'll have images in my head from the book. Uh, I'll take pictures when I'm outside and I'll put those up around my writing place. I find pieces of art that I want to sort of conjure in the book, you know, or whatever. Um, Sometimes I have pictures of people, and I think that I want my characters to sort of conjure them, things like that. So the visual is real important.
Thank
Anything
you.
else?
Other questions, guys?
While we're waiting for somebody, I will just say that when the book came out, it was pretty controversial because of the drug use that's in the book. Now, I think it's almost become a cliche. There's so many books that are about drugs in rural communities. I included that just because that was the world that I knew. That was, you know, I was 23 years old when I started writing this book. Um, like I said, I ran with a pretty wild crowd, you know, and um, there was a lot of drug use around me. I mean, the people I knew really closely weren't people doing cocaine and things like that, but I knew of people who did that, you know, and especially smoking pot and things like that. I just don't think that it would be accurate to write about that place and set it in the year 2000 and there not be drug use among people in their 20s. It just wouldn't be authentic. But a lot of people got really upset at me and said that that was stereotypical to have the drug use. Um, People also were upset because of the domestic violence in the book, and they felt like that was stereotypical for an Appalachian man to be a wife beater presented that way. My response to that is domestic violence happens in every culture. It's a problem globally. It's especially a problem in Appalachia, uh, and I mean in America. And so of course it's a problem in Appalachia because Appalachia is part of America. And so lots of times when people say these things are stereotypes, I think it's just a reflection of the whole country or the whole world, you know, or just humanity. You can't not have people doing bad things just because you have it set in a particular place. If you make it if you make people too good, that's as I think as offensive and simplifying as making them too bad. So I never want to romanticize the place. I also don't want to vilify it. And so, you know, the domestic violence that happens in the book is because of this individual man who is bad, not because of the place, you know? Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Let's see. Have others from the area you grew up in reacted to your depiction of Eastern Kentucky? Well, I think most people have been very complimentary. Um, at the same time, everybody reacts to a piece of literature or anything. Everybody reacts differently. You're never going to please everybody. So, I mean, I can't tell you how many letters I've had from people saying, thank you so much for not stereotyping my people. And then I get letters that'll say, you have done so much damage, you stereotyped my people. So, all I can do is try to honestly portray the place the best I know how. When you're from Eastern Kentucky, lots of times if you get any kind of public, if you're visible in the public eye at all, people put the sort of a sign of responsibility to you that you have to represent it in a particular way. I don't know how to do that. I mean, I don't know how to be anything other than who I am and write about what I know, you know. I don't have any kind of agenda for sure of trying to vilify the place or romanticize it. My only agenda is to write about it honestly. However, I do want to portray people in a complex way, and I want to illuminate the dignity of working class rural people, simply because I think that I'm correcting a long history. And I'm not the only writer who's doing that, but I am a writer who's trying to correct that history of people being just stereotyped. My main agenda is just not to stereotype, it's just to show real human beings. Real human beings make mistakes and aren't always perfect. But I think my characters are mostly trying their best to be the best people they can be, you know. And the reason my characters are doing that is because the people that I know and grew up around are doing that. You know, I'm just trying to show the place honestly. Anything else? I'm glad to talk as long as y'all want to, but I don't want to keep you too long. I know you have other things to do.
Other questions? So can we do a lightning round real quick to wrap us up?
Yeah.
All right. So one of the things I saw in here is you describe a lot of things I picked up. You describe a lot of things as silver. I don't know if that was intentional, but kind of where did that come from in the book? Any significance to
I
that?
don't know. I mean, a lot of those things that um, I don't know how to explain this except that to some degree the book is sort of in control of the book, and the writer just sort of you you as the writer often I don't know those sorts of connections or metaphors or things like that are in there until I've written the book. And then I see them and I might turn the volume up on them just a notch. I definitely did that with the red birds, where I noticed, okay, this is a symbol of Aneth. It's a symbol of the place, of these people. And so in the whole trilogy, red birds are in the whole trilogy and show up. I've been trying for 20 years now to get a red bird on the cover of one of these editions of Clay's Quilt, and they won't do it. But
Maybe the movie.
maybe. But anyway, yeah, I think that those things only work if they're organic, if that makes sense. If you try to force them in, or if you're too conscious of them, then they don't work well.
Okay. So you also, your great grandmother, I think, was full-blooded Cherokee, and you talk about in the book the kind of the Native American imagery and that kind of stuff. Have you done 23andMe or Ancestry of any of that? What'd you find out?
Well, the thing is, when you're from a specific part of the country, you're always told that you have Native American blood.
That's why I ask. That's why I ask.
And so I was always told that. I never knew for sure until two things happened. In genealogical research, I found where my great great grandfather had signed up for reparations when reparations were being given to Native Americans who had been removed from North Carolina. He is on that roll, so we know that he applied for reparations. That's sort of where the paper trail ends. And the other part of it is the part that doesn't. It doesn't matter to the Cherokee Nation if you have DNA. That doesn't go into play if you get on the rolls or not. But it did show up in my DNA as like, I think it's 7 or 8% Native American.
I asked because I also, growing up in Eastern Kentucky, and like many here, we're told our whole life we had Cherokee, and then I did it and I had zero. And I went back to my mom and I said, I can't believe you betrayed me in this way.
Well, and it gets so, it gets real complicated because on one hand, that's part of my identity. I was raised being told that, and now it's showing up in my DNA, or and all that stuff, and then the reparations documents. But at the same time, I never want to I don't want to try to steal anybody's identity or claim a story for myself. I certainly wasn't raised culturally as Cherokee or anything like that. So I wrote A Portrait from the Leaves that does have a Cherokee main character, but to me that book is a lot more about the way her history was stolen from her because of people being erased because of their ethnicity than it is about me claiming a Cherokee. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Sorry, my beagle's starting to whine in the background. He's wanting to go out. But anyway, I will just say before we hang up that after Clay's Quilt, I did continue to think about these characters, and so I ended up writing. Eventually, my third book is about Clay's mother and aunt. It's about Aneth and Easter, and so if you did enjoy Clay's Quilt, I hope you might read the prequel, where you find out more about Aneth and Easter. And Clay is in utero in that book, but that's as much as he shows up.
There we go.
Can I pop in just really quick? Scott sent me a message. He wanted to know if you would want to be involved in any artistic aspect if there were to be a film. And I want to piggyback on that. And if you do, can I audition?
Well, I would love that. I mean, they are trying to make a movie right now of Southernmost, and they have been really, they have included me in the whole process. I've been part of the casting process and all that. But ultimately, that's sort of, they just try to make you feel like that you're involved, and ultimately you have no control. And they ask me for suggestions all the time, then they never listen. Like they'll always say, "Who would you like to play this role?" And then they never pursue them. But it's sort of just trying to keep the author to keep a good relationship. But ultimately, I know I have no control. Yeah. And like I said, Clay's Quilt and Portrait from the Leaves were both option for film and didn't make it. And now Southernmost is. So I try not to get my hopes up too much about that, and just sort of not think about it too much. But I've been really happy just to see the people who've read the books that I've, actors I admire, because they're trying to make it. But yeah, you look like you'd fit right in. You make a good Alma with your hair color. So
Silas, thank you so much for being here. We appreciate you spending the last hour with us talking about this book and the importance of this and our efforts to integrate Appalachian literature into our classrooms and to expose our kids to different kinds of cultures and to also reflect their own cultures in a lot of ways. And we think this is a great way to do that. So we appreciate your time, appreciate your writing this book for us and all the things that you've done. So thank you very much for being here. It's been an absolute pleasure.
I appreciate y'all using the book, and if I can be of help in any of your classrooms in the future, just let me know. You can always contact me at my website.
Perfect.
Y'all have
Thank
a
you
good
so
one.
much. Thanks everybody for being here.
Thank
Bye-bye,
you.
everybody.
Bye-bye.
Get that beagle out.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.